So since our last meeting, we had the in-person planning and zoning meeting in, I think that was June, or was that July?
June, right?
June.
Oh yeah, that was June, yes.
Okay, wow, yeah, it feels like. All right, so, and then we did have, this month was the planning and zoning sort of updates. So in the meantime, Anthony had gotten together changes to the ADU ordinances and presented that to the planning and zoning meeting on last week. So I did attend that, and it was a great meeting, very lively discussion. So we're, I don't want to say back to the drawing board because of that, but some of the things that we had talked about, I think were not necessarily written into the ordinance changes the way, certainly the way Amber and I expected, and then other members of planning and zoning kind of felt the same way. So as a result of that, I did not go to the Human Services Commission meeting last week because we were sort of anticipating having something much more complete for that. So that's been postponed. And then also because we don't have sort of the official sign off from planning and zoning to the changes that we want, we've also postponed the city council work sessions. So Tuesday, tomorrow, we are not having a work session about the ADU changes. That's been postponed to September. So, so that's where we're at right now. So I am actually going to try sharing my screen, and Amber, I know you have the, well, actually, no, I sent this to everybody. The changes that Anthony had made. So Kristen, did you get that in your email? Were you able to?
I did, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So follow up from that meeting and some of the notes that I had made were, we talked about specifically like from the get-go. Actually, I probably should, since we do have an attendee, I am going to share my screen. So let me see if I can figure out how to do that. I'm going to share screen one. Okay, can you guys see the memo on my screen?
Not yet. No.
Not yet? Okay. Oh, sorry. Hold on.
Now
Yeah.
we can.
All right, cool. So this was the memo that went along with the planning and zoning agenda. And so this talks about, you know, sort of the background information that typically accompanies not only planning and zoning, but also this memo will accompany the city council packet as well when we get to that point. So from the get-go, under the definitions in section 1, we talked about initially Anthony had defined them as detached, and that was something that I think we as a group had talked about detached as well as attached ADUs. And so that was something that that was kind of the biggest problematic thing was if we're going to go, he kind of assumed that we would go detached, which is maybe a smaller bite of the issue. And because the consensus among planning and zoning was that we go ahead and not limit attached ADUs, that's kind of what threw us back to the drawing board, because there's much more that needs to be changed within our zoning, because it's going to be much more what's the word I'm looking for? less restrictive and more changes potentially for single family residential to become multifamily. Because if you talk about attached, that is maybe bordering on, is it a duplex? Is it multifamily within single family zoning? So, I think the reason Anthony didn't do it is because he was afraid of kind of what happened in Webster, which, you know, we've all talked about how they were really trying to, I think maybe take too big of a step. So in this case, he's revising other sections that need to be revised, and then he's also going to run those changes by our city attorney, of course, to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row before we get to that point. So that was kind of the biggest portion of the conversation, I think, really. And Amber, please, you know, chime in, since you clearly were there and probably took better notes than I did.
I didn't take nearly as good a notes as other people at the table, but I think I would just add that it seemed pretty clear from the majority of the commission members that we really want to see this ordinance have the biggest impact possible. So in limiting it to detached, we really weren't facilitating the greatest amount of impact that we might have in creating more volume in terms of housing availability. The presumption by most commission members was that allowing people to create an accessory dwelling within their existing structure would likely be more affordable and accessible to people who are interested in pursuing that. Yeah, as Sandy notes, there was a great deal of conversation around that. And I think the spirit of the change is really best captured by expanding the opportunity there to not confine it to be only detached units, but allowing what some municipalities call the junior ADU, being one that is attached to the principal residence.
Yeah.
And so we obviously talked a lot about square footage requirements that would mitigate any zoning impacts around it being multifamily or being a duplex, but I think that's probably a little bit further down in some of the language here.
Yeah, so that's actually a good segue, because when we were talking about, and specifically again in section 4, you know, the language under subsection C says a smaller independent residential dwelling unit with kitchen and bathroom facilities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that kind of was the key driver of that conversation, is that it is smaller in square footage. So we talked about now the subsection 1 under subsection C. I don't know how many subsections. Anyway, part 1 under subsection C, where it says not to exceed 700 square feet. That's one of the things that is potentially going to be modified. We talked about increasing that while potentially adding a limit of on an attached. So that would be potentially 800 for a detached, and then adding for the attached maybe 500, so that it's a smaller square footage. To make it pretty clear that if it's attached, it's, you know, it's not 2/3 of the original house or half of the original house. And then one of the things that Anthony brought up was actually in the case of potentially a 3-story home, if someone were to make the 3rd story or the basement level or something like that of their home into an ADU, we wanted it to be flexible, or the language to be flexible enough to allow so that they didn't have to like carve out sort of a specific space. So, you know, if 1/3 of their house happened to be larger than the 500 square feet, then, you know, then the language would hopefully accommodate that. So again, to try to make it as flexible as possible while still maintaining the idea that it's, you know, it's a portion of someone's home, and not the majority. So that we talked kind of specifically about some designs. There's a book that Anthony had with him that former Mayor Greenberg has loaned to him. He's also Barry Greenberg is, of course, is an architect and is working up some plans for ADUs. And that's also something that in the future, that I know other cities have done this, and in the future I'd like to see Maplewood do this, where we have uh, uh, pre-approved plans so that someone doesn't need to hire an architect. That, you know, we would have these pre-approved plans. So if you have, you know, if you want a 600 square foot ADU in your backyard, here's some plans. There you go.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and I think that's a real possibility, and would hopefully keep it more affordable for people. So, trying to think of kind of what else came of some of those. That I know the other big thing that we talked about was parking, and I want to hold off on that for a second. But Amber, was there anything else that I'm missing in terms of sort of that the square footage or any of those?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think for the attached one, Anthony was doing some research to kind of ascertain best practices in other cities that have adopted this. I think the code sample that I sent him had potentially up to a 600 square foot attached unit. But I think we're just waiting to hear back from him about what his research yields.
Okay, cool. Oh, and do you know, because the text that I got from Michael, since your next meeting is on Labor Day, or would have been scheduled for Labor Day, first Monday?
It will now be on the Wednesday of that week.
Okay,
I believe that's
so
the 7th.
that's the 7th. Okay, good deal. So that is actually then the same night or the same day as the Human Services Commission. So, which Michael did when he texted me, he said that you guys meet at different times, because I know you don't start until 7, right?
Well, that's interesting because Anthony did ask if we could start earlier.
Oh.
So we might have a little bit of a traffic jam in council chambers.
Yeah, and that'll be interesting if I have to be in 2 places at once.
Maybe we can co-meet, make it
Hey,
more efficient.
Although I'm sure they have lots.
They have a pretty lengthy agenda, I'm sure. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so then I guess next up, once he finishes those changes, is planning and zoning on the 7th. And then the following week is the council work session, which, you know, again, that's been postponed until the 13th. So our next meeting is 4 weeks from tonight, which is the 12th. That's the second Monday in September. So let me see. Actually, I did get an email back from Kristen. Nope, that's just you guys sharing your cell numbers. Okay. Sorry, I thought I might have had an email from Angela about tonight's meeting. Sorry, distracted myself.
And a little off topic, but just out of curiosity, how long is our committee going to continue to meet?
That's a darn good question. Thanks for asking. Interestingly, one of the newer planning and zoning commission members had asked about joining this committee, and mentioned that because we have such a daunting task ahead of us, that he felt like we could use some help. And I said, absolutely. We certainly could use some help, because there's a lot to go through. but no, I mean, it's something we haven't really, necessarily set an end date to. So I know, Kristen, now that you're on, another board or commission as
Right.
well.
And my internet went out, so I didn't hear anything you said after somebody else was interested.
Oh, whoops.
That's totally my fault.
So yeah, so the other, someone on the Planning and Zoning Commission was asking about, additional, them joining us on the committee, because we do have so much, so much on our plate for zoning ordinance review. And to be honest, I think, I agree that we have a lot. So I'm kind of at that point now of thinking, should we be putting some of this back to the actual P and Z, and then meeting as on a more ad hoc basis. Like once we get this, I kept saying I really wanted to get the ADUs across the finish line because we thought that was going to be easy. Silly us. So we've definitely learned that it is taking a lot more time and effort, and a lot more changes need to occur. But what do you guys think? I mean, Amber, obviously you're part of that. So,
Well, what's sort of come forward with some of our newer members is that they are looking closely at the code as part of their onboarding process. And it did make me wonder if maybe the committee is responsive to requests made by the commission to review and make recommendations for specific sections. That said, we don't currently have any kind of dedicated time in our meetings set aside to talk about the ordinance, the code. So, that would sort of require a change in how we're conducting our meetings. But I know that, and maybe you were on, Sandy, when they went through this process, that P&Z has done a process of updating the code themselves as part of their monthly meeting. I believe it was the special business district that they did.
yeah, it was actually right after I left P&Z because I was elected to council. But yeah, I think for a couple of months in a row, P&Z did go through and make those recommendations. And then they came to council from that point, and then council made additional changes, but kind of the working in tandem, where that initially some of that just cleaning up the language, and in the case of the SB and NB neighborhood businesses, things like taking out antiquated language, instead of saying massage parlor, changing things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So some of that was actually relatively easy, and then and taking out redundancies, and if it's allowed, then or it's permitted, then it doesn't necessarily need to be conditional, and all those things. So I think a lot of that heavy lifting certainly was done by P&Z before it even came to council. And I think I kind of expected that we would do some of that and kind of get it to a point where we would be making changes to, and then having P&Z look at it. And I feel like we kind of did that as part of the Google Doc, but then P&Z hasn't really sort of taken up the next step.
Right. Yeah, and we've so far just limited ourselves to the residential. So we could potentially have P&Z focus on those comments and provide some feedback around that if we wanted to sort of look at it in a chunk. But I do get the impression that there are probably P&Z members who have ideas about specific areas of the code that they'd like looked at more closely.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know how yeah, I'm just not quite sure how to, the best way to approach and implement that dynamic.
I'm just making a note here. Because I feel like if there are sections besides the residential, that, I mean, really once, I'm trying to think of what else is left after residential. Because certainly if there are things that that they would like us to look at as a committee, then we can sort of start that dialogue, have those conversations, make the comments in the Google Doc, and then sort of pass the football back to P and Z. I don't know, I don't know what kind of the most effective use of this committee is going forward. So, Kristen, was there, and not to put you on the spot, but was there a specific reason you were asking the question? Just sort of,
Just like you said, just because I'm thankfully on another board, and so I'm just trying to figure out how to juggle everything.
Yeah. So definitely something that that I need to talk to Michael and Anthony about is kind of, where do we go from here once we get this, get these ordinances updated, what's the next step? And you guys both already know, I'm now, however many months away from the end of my time on city council. So whether or not I go back to planning and zoning, if there's an opening on planning and zoning when I'm done, I don't know what that looks like yet. And I don't know, sort of what this committee looks like after I'm no longer on council. The whole idea behind having a second council person was to sort of have that backup, that continuation. Sean and I are actually on the same election schedule. So I don't know for sure if Sean is running for re-election or not. And unfortunately, he hasn't attended any of these meetings. So I don't know if he's, willing to sort of take up the cause and continue with it or not. So, so at the very least, it might end with the end of my term on council. I don't know.
Had the other groups who are also tasked with looking at the ordinances, have they wrapped up, or are they still going, or do we know?
I believe Parks is done. They had, of course, a much smaller section because that was led by Karen, and then Jenny was the second council member, and they're obviously both gone. But I believe they're done. Offenses is still going. Again, they have a huge task ahead of them for offenses. And Jenny is still running those meetings, even though she's no longer on council. So, but they also have a pretty dedicated, committed team that meets once a month on Saturday mornings for several hours.
Wow.
So, yeah. So yeah, so I don't know. And we actually have not seen, from council's perspective, we haven't seen any changes that have come from that committee yet. So I think they're still, sort of working through some of the nitty gritty before they bring things to council. So, so yeah, I don't know. Well, to circle back around to the changes for the ADUs, we definitely did have some conversations around parking. And as we all know, that is always a hot topic when it comes to Maplewood. And I think, once again, I think what we had talked about as a group and what P and Z had talked about as a group was to not increase the parking requirements. But lo and behold, the parking requirements, the way Anthony wrote it, were increased +1. So again, I think the majority of planning and zoning was not in favor of that. So we talked about, and specifically, I'm drawing a blank on what's his name, the architect.
Mark
Mark.
Van Den Akker.
Yes, Mark specifically, and thank goodness, he definitely has done his homework because he was looking at an ADU sort of from the perspective, I think, of businesses. And so he was explaining about how the parking requirements for businesses are different than they are for residential, and how you have to have spaces in tandem and not stacked. So that definitely causes a hardship. I mean, most of us in Maplewood, even for single family residential, don't even have 2 off-street spaces that you can park in tandem. I mean, we're lucky to have 2 off-street spaces that you can park stacked to pull 2 cars into your driveway. So we're lucky to have that without being on the street or blocking the sidewalk. So I think the idea from what was written here versus what we're changing it to is that the parking spaces will be the same as single family residential, which is 2 parking spaces, 2 off-street parking spaces. And then being a conditional use, it's still, the staff or P and Z or council can still basically say that, yes, you can have an ADU even if you don't have 2 off-street parking. We kind of talked about how some places, some streets in Maplewood have very limited availability of street parking, and others have plenty. So I think, the conditional use aspect of that is really going to determine what parking is going to be required for an ADU. So that, again, Amber, please chime in on that.
Yeah, I think the one additional thing that came up is sort of part of that conditional use permit process, which we already engage in P&Z, pretty substantive discussions about available parking anytime we're making a ruling on a proposed conditional use, is that there was a commission member who also wanted to, in some way, weave in proximity to transit as part of the consideration. Obviously, if we're not putting a parking requirement on there, it wouldn't necessarily be an exception, but I think he wanted some way to indicate that if we are discussing a conditional use and there's a question about adequacy of parking, that proximity to transit should be a consideration that the commission makes.
Yeah, and that I think it goes without saying, for people who use transit, they're aware of proximity to transit in Maplewood is pretty much everywhere. I mean, Big Bend runs smack dab down the middle of our city, and Manchester runs, along 2/3 of our city. So if you are within walking distance of either Big Bend or Manchester, you have access to at least a bus. So so that's definitely one thing that we have going for us is access to transit. I think someone else brought up the idea that if this ADU is used by a elderly parent or something like that, they may not have their own transportation anyway. So so that's another aspect. And knowing that it's a conditional use, it's not like this permit for an ADU is going to go in perpetuity along with the house. So if someone, receives a conditional use because their elderly parent doesn't drive and there's no additional parking needed, doesn't necessarily mean if they sell their house that, that conditional use for the ADU is gonna go along with the new owner. So, it would, it would change the scenario. The ingress egress for emergency services, that's, pretty self-explanatory. I think we're removing the word medical, just to make sure that it's, any kind of emergency services that, the access to the ADU can't be behind a locked gate, something like that. And maximum one per lot. We're not looking to build a tiny house community in someone's backyard, as lovely as that would be, but that's not what we're doing. And then we talked about the setbacks. So I think, the side yard and the rear yard and the distance from any principal structure, I forget which one of those. I know there was discussion about that, but I actually don't have notes as to which one was kind of more controversial or problematic.
I think, you're talking about the setbacks?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was the rear one was going to be reduced.
Okay. Yeah.
To make them equivalent 5 feet on all sides.
Okay.
Because it is right now the requirement that a garage needs a 5-foot setback from the back of the lot. So to make that consistent.
That's right. Yeah.
But that the distance between the accessory structure and the main structure would still need to be 10 feet for fire suppression purposes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Oh, and I just completely skipped over number 5. That short-term vacation rentals are prohibited in accessory dwelling units. So that was something, to be honest, I could go either way with it. So, but I think the majority of the commission members felt like it should be, if our true intention is to make this about affordable housing, that that's something that they wanted to prohibit. So those were kind of the major changes that Anthony is working on. Is there anything that I missed?
I don't think so.
Okay. Stop sharing. All right. Anything else at this point other than kind of the upcoming meetings? Trying to think of if there was anything else. Sorry, I'm just looking at my other screen. I think I can't. Not coming up with anything else that came as a result of the P&Z meeting. So, and I don't, again, because I have not attended the Human Services Commission. Someone did suggest to attend the sustainability meeting as well. And I'm not sure, what their, I would have to look and see what their schedule is.
I think they'd be interested to know that this change is being proposed.
Yeah.
And may have additional feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll take a look at at their meeting schedule and see if I can squeeze that one in as well once we get to the next step for September. Of course, with council, we'll have a work session, and then it would go on the agenda. And it takes, of course, 2 readings, so 2 council meetings. We are back to a full schedule in September, I believe. So we should have 2 meetings in September. So there's the potential that the changes could be on the second meeting in September. And then, that would be officially signed off on.
Yeah.
So our next meeting is the 12th. So we will, anything that comes from planning and zoning, I'll bring back to you guys. Is there anything else, sort of just thinking ahead to either that meeting or the October meeting, which potentially, if we're going to continue with this process, is there anything sort of that you guys would like to see going forward? Either Amber, if there's something that's already come up from the P and Z members that you already know of that we can sort of start to take a look at?
Yeah, I would prefer to solicit that in a more formal way. I know there have been things that have been brought up at the commission table, but I think making that part of, so there's a standing agenda item now on the P and Z agenda monthly to discuss what's been happening in this committee. So I think I'd like to take the opportunity at the next meeting to invite those members to think through whether we should engage in some kind of formalized process to identify areas that we would like a closer look at, if we think that would be productive.
Yeah, yeah. Do you get the sense that with the new members that meeting monthly is, sort of, because I know in the past, P and Z didn't always meet monthly. If there wasn't anything to approve, then there was just no meeting. Do you get the sense that meeting monthly is something that they're up for?
Potentially, it hasn't been formally discussed. And I would say this year, we've probably, out of the 8 months of this year, met 5 times. So I don't think that anybody has felt like meeting monthly would be an undue burden if we're making progress on a specific set of tasks.
Yeah.
But again, I think that's something to be discussed in that group.
Yeah.
But I do get a feeling that there is energy among the members around this process and an interest in making it, supporting it moving forward.
Yeah, yeah. And Kristen, again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is this something that you want to continue meeting monthly if we're actually making some progress and we kind of have that back and forth with P and Z?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know how long term, just because I want to, make sure to focus on the other board to, give it its rightful due. Yeah, in the meantime, like for right now, for the next few months, for sure.
Okay. All right, great. And if there's ever a time that you need to step aside, please, it's all volunteer. So yeah, just let me know. But otherwise, we will plan on meeting again 4 weeks. So September 12th, I guess that's 4 weeks, unless there's an extra Monday in September. 1, 2, 3. No, it's actually 5 weeks from now. So September 12th, the second Monday in September. And by that point, hopefully we will have some, specific ordinance changes that will be imminently on the council agenda. And then we'll go from there. So thank you guys for your time tonight. I appreciate it. And again, apologies for the technical difficulties at the start. But I'll get this new Zoom when they gave me a new laptop for work, they took Zoom or they didn't reinstall Zoom. And I can't reinstall the actual software. So, I'm just using the web version, I guess. But yeah, good old work computer. You know how that goes. So thank you guys. And if I don't talk to you before, well, I know Amber, I'll be seeing you at the next P and Z meeting, but otherwise, Have a good night.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, you too.
Have a good night.
Bye.